around specific themes that will be facilitated by subject matter experts, and then we'll reconvene at the end for take a few key points from each room, and we'll also have a short poll that helps us guide future activity. We're very pleased to have Professor Andrew Goudie and Ewan Mearns to kick the presentation off, and then we have 4 breakout rooms that I'll describe shortly. As far as engagement's concerned, then there are sort of 3 ways really. One, using the chat box on Zoom and the raise hand function if you need to speak to somebody. We encourage people also to use social media, and I think the hashtag is contact is there shown on the screen there. And also the main thing in terms of engagement is the breakout rooms, where we'll split into smaller groups and people will get a chance to discuss the themes that we've identified. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see the breakout rooms shown there. So the first one, infrastructure in place, Hannah Smith is going to lead that. Labour market and tackling inequalities, Phil Ford. Business resilience, Susan Love. Climate change and energy, Lynn Ross. And I'm grateful to all of them for joining us today. And the sort of questions that we're hoping to stimulate is how might, given the scenarios and ideas we'll hear from Andrew and Ewan, how might we need to rethink existing plans and priorities in terms of ambitions, priorities and the like. And then also looking back from, say, a position 5 years hence, if things went well, what the sort of things might we highlight as being important things that have helped the economy recover and be more resilient. So that's the plan for the day. So I think without further ado, Andrew, if you're ready, I'm going to invite you to kick us off. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Charlie, very much. And good morning, all. I want to speak today about life after COVID-19, or perhaps more accurately, life as we move into the recovery phase of this crisis in the medium term, albeit with COVID still impacting heavily on our thinking and no doubt on our activity too. Perhaps we could have the second slide, please. There are 3 threads that I'd like to touch upon. Firstly, the impact of this crisis on our highest level global objectives. Secondly, the economic and financial implications of our response to the crisis. And thirdly, the medium-term challenges and choices in the recovery period post the peak of the crisis, which brings the first 2 elements here together. Let me start with the impact of this crisis on our highest level global thinking. We have understandably over recent months been primarily concerned with the immediate, with the humanitarian dimension of the health crisis, with the most vulnerable, and with the potential economic damage to the economic system. And now we are turning our attention to the complex challenges around the phased remobilization of the economy. But my starting point here is that there is, of course, also the need to be thinking about the medium term now. What has COVID changed? Has anything changed permanently? What should change? And how should global and national priorities change in the light of COVID? And perhaps most fundamentally of all, will there actually ultimately be a great enough appetite for profound and transformational change? I ask this with the 2008 financial crisis very much in mind. While that crisis was equally poorly anticipated, and the growing risks in the decade prior to the crisis were equally dismissed by most in the business, economic and financial communities, our understanding of the issues then advanced very quickly as the crisis struck with full force. Clearly, the global financial system was not sustainable in its form then and was not resilient to future shocks, and there were important issues to urgently resolve. But while steps were taken, it's clear to me that as the fear of global financial meltdown evaporated, the pressure for change also evaporated. The process of rebuilding a sustainable and resilient global financial system lost momentum, with the required transformation remaining incomplete and with continuing susceptibility to future shocks. And I think there's a real danger of that same scenario recurring here. Perhaps we could have the third slide, please. This picture poses quite a simple question in one sense. What are our global priorities now? What should they be? Government strategists have for decades said a great deal about their vision for the economy, the nature of the society that they seek to build, and more recently, their environmental objectives. But they have said little, if anything, about global health or even national health in a global context. The focus has been on normal, familiar, and of course, very important health concerns, on people's current quality of life, on domestic health inequalities, but almost always inward-looking and invariably with an overwhelmingly national focus. We have rarely brought global health into that picture, certainly not in a sustained manner, reflecting a real depth of understanding of the reality and power of our interdependent world. A key question now must surely be, should global health unambiguously be one of our 4 primary global objectives, intimately related to our economic, our social, and our environmental visions? And perhaps more challengingly, should we see global health and global environmental sustainability as the underpinning, as the precondition for our global economic and social vision? This seems to raise some key challenges for economists. Simply put, is this pandemic and the high probability of more frequent, perhaps even more devastating pandemics in the future, a reason for revisiting the nature of the economic system that has evolved? Do we need to rethink and refocus globalization to unambiguously reflect the totality of these 4 global outcomes and give a greater prioritization to the resilience and sustainability of this system? And given the immensity of this pandemic, how urgent is it to build this resilience in preparation for perhaps another external shock in the future? COVID-19 is, of course, raising other very fundamental and related questions about our world and the nature of our society, about poverty and inequality, about the most vulnerable in global and national society, but not just from the standpoint of people's often very subjective perceptions of what is a fair or an unfair world or society. What does that look like? But also from the fact that global inequalities probably lie at the root of the COVID-19 crisis itself. That poverty is a key determinant in the transmission of viruses from the animal kingdom into the human species, with the devastating consequences that we now see. I want to link this high-level thinking about global priorities and global resilience to the second issue, that is the medium-term implications of this crisis and the climate in which change, if it is indeed to happen, will have to occur. We're all very familiar now, I think, with the stunning impact that COVID-19, and specifically the first humanitarian phase of the crisis, has had on the global and national economies. The almost overnight closure of huge swathes of economic activity. To crystallize our thoughts, let me show you 2 pictures. If you could put up the 4th slide, please. Firstly, looking at global output and taking the most recent IMF scenarios from the April World Economic Outlook to illustrate. These scenarios are, of course, laced with massive uncertainty, as with everybody else. More than ever before, the range of possibilities is huge. There's also, moreover, considerable variation across the globe, notably between the higher and lower income economies. However, the broad picture is likely to be similar. There is now emerging a heavy cumulative loss of output, which will be highly significant, even if we return to the previous growth path. But much more likely, under most scenarios, is the prospect of resumption of only a significantly lower growth path, as you see here. In the case of the advanced countries, GDP is estimated to fall by around 12% in 2020 before climbing slowly back. Indeed, it is likely that it will only establish a lower long-term growth path, at least for many years, as this shows. Not only is the course of the health crisis highly uncertain, and especially the evolution of the science, but it's hard to assess the fundamental long-term structural damage that's now being done to national economies at the height of the crisis. Similarly, and unsurprisingly, global trade is estimated by the WTO to mirror these output paths. They estimate that trade will fall by between 15 and 30% this year, and again, being unlikely to recover to the pre-COVID growth path, which itself was already well below the pre-financial crisis trade path. One of the critical implications of the economic response to the COVID crisis, motivated by this huge collapse of output, trade, employment, and incomes, has of course been for the fiscal outlook for most economies. Once again, the experience hasn't been the same across all economies. The poorest nations have been less able to respond to the crisis, but the UK and other high-income countries have made huge investments, as you know, in their economies to try to avert long-term damage. Governments have assumed previously unseen degrees of economic control and offered unimaginable levels of support in most areas of economic activity, so that in many respects, the state has become the economy of last resort. The impact on national deficits in 2020 will be immense, and we still don't know how immense, but the OBR has recently suggested that the UK deficit could rise to 273 billion in 2020. That would be 200 billion higher than previously expected pre-COVID for this year. The current unlocking phase is likely to be characterized by non-linear progress and will probably be very protracted. And undoubtedly, the greater the economic disruption in these phases, the greater will be the economic cost in general, and the greater the budgetary costs in particular. Globally, deficits are already anticipated to reach exceptional levels. If you could put up slide 5 for me, please. These are the latest IMF Fiscal Monitor illustrations. Here, the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio for the high-income economies is estimated to rise sharply from around 3 or 4% in the pre-COVID period to around 10 or 11% this year, with the US rising to exceptionally high levels, as you see. It seems to me inevitable that these trends will play a very dominant role in much of the thinking around medium-term adjustment programs in the next phase of recovery for most nations. And we can see it even more starkly if we look at the path of global debt to GDP ratios in slide 6, please. Again, these are from the IMF Fiscal Monitor report, and they are illustrative. Of course, nobody knows the precise numbers, with the high-income economies showing a striking upward trend. Indeed, we can see the growth in debt to GDP ratios during the financial crisis here, from around 70–80% of GDP pre that crisis to around 100–110% of GDP in the 2011–19 period. And notice that there was no real decline in that over the last 10 years. And now, as a consequence of the COVID fiscal responses, it's estimated there will be a further sharp rise to over 120% of GDP in the advanced countries in 2020. And in the lower income economies, the ratios are typically lower, but we see a similar trend, which is equally concerning given their very much smaller capacity to withstand these shocks and respond. I think unwinding this striking growth in fiscal deficits and this accumulation of such extraordinary debt burdens is now the crucial issue. The third point I want to briefly mention today is really to tie together these first 2 points that I've made. It concerns the challenge now, in essence, managing the macroeconomic and microeconomic legacy of the COVID crisis and its impact on the big global and national questions that I started talking about. I think there are 2 central challenges for the medium term that stand out here for me. Firstly, there is the post-COVID adjustment. as that brief debt analysis that I've just done shows, there will be an adjustment process over the medium term as strategies are defined to bring budget deficits down and reduce debt ratios. What form will this adjustment take? Well, austerity is a highly emotive word, as you know, so let's avoid the word austerity. But there will be an adjustment of some sort to what governments and financiers and markets see as a sustainable financial future. And this will raise very profound questions, as we've seen over the last 10 years. And there is a further dimension to this too. How urgent is this process of rebuilding sustainable and resilient financial structures when we do face the threat of potential shocks in the future? Starting from a position of weakness is always dangerous. The second challenge over the medium term is what will be the priorities for spend in this highly constrained climate that I see coming. The critical question that links my 2 points today is therefore, in a world that now will be massively resource constrained, will the big global objectives that I started talking about find a place at a time of burgeoning national needs? If we really respond appropriately to the big global health, environmental and poverty questions, the costs will be considerable, and questions of what will be deprioritized will be necessary and of course highly contentious. And there are also the more national priorities. What will be the response to the massive issues that have emerged in the crisis? The future of the NHS, the value we place on essential workers, the future care of the most vulnerable in society, and in general, the future direction of the welfare state itself. All these constitute huge political and societal challenges for the medium term. Perhaps we could have the 7th slide, please. So I want to stop and leave you with a few imponderables, a few really tough questions in my mind at least. Firstly, are we moving to a world characterized by a much sharper global vision, giving a priority to global health and global environment? And will the response this time now be proportionate to the scale of the risks? How will the massive costs of the economic response to the COVID crisis be managed over the medium term? And how will financial sustainability be established? There will clearly be major new post-COVID needs and demands, but will there ultimately be transformational steps in thinking, focused on major aspirations, new societal values and new priorities? And if so, how will these powerful competing demands for new expenditures over the medium term be reconciled amidst a world of much, much tighter fiscal resources? Thank you very much indeed for listening. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Andrew. That's a great sort of summary of where we are, where we've got to, and what some of the questions we really need to be thinking seriously about. So and one way of doing that is by sort of projecting various scenarios of how the future might unfold. And to help us in this thinking, let's move on to Ewan now, and to take us through the work that Scottish Enterprise and the Scottish Government have been doing in this regard. So Ewan, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Charlie, and morning, everyone. And thanks, Andrew, for great introduction to the topic. I want to do 3 things just now. I want to describe the value of scenario thinking in these highly uncertain times. Briefly just describe the process that we're delivering with Scottish Government. And then thirdly, give you a bit more of an overview of the 4 scenarios that we're looking at, which should hopefully give you some context to help support the discussions in the breakouts. So if we go on to the next slide, I don't want to dwell on this. I think actually this runs on really well from what Andrew has just been saying. We're living in a time of huge uncertainty. So some of the changes that and the possibilities that we're considering just now would have just been inconceivable a few months ago. So scenario thinking is really a powerful tool to help us to manage and think about this uncertainty, to think about the implications on our current and potential future plans. So the final point, and I think Andrew again has alluded to this, the crisis is having significant impacts, but it's layered on top of lots of existing trends that we are all recognizing. So it's really the interdependencies between these, which are the interesting and highly uncertain thing that we need to think about. So we know before COVID, we had changing demographics. We've seen a slowing of globalization. We've seen rising inequalities, and we've had a climate emergency. So if we combine all of that, what does that mean for how we take this forward? And I love the Peter Drucker quote at the bottom there. And I think we need new thinking to help us plan for the future world. So let's move on to the next slide. So scenario thinking is a tried and tested tool for managing uncertainty. It provides this broader context to help us make sense of where we are now. But importantly, what it does is it gives us a much broader range of alternative but plausible futures. So we're breaking out of our default mode is in terms of making assumptions about the future. We all do this every single day. We just assume that the future is going to play out in a particular way, but it might not. We've got a huge range of uncertainties. So let's broaden the range of uncertainties that we're thinking about. And the most important point here is that it's not just an abstract or academic exercise. What we're trying to do is rehearse how we might then respond in different scenarios to then inform the decisions that we need to take today. So we're going to go into the future and then take all of these insights back today. I should also say what we're not doing is making predictions or forecasts. We're just asking, what if this happened? So actually on the first slide, there was a disclaimer. So I feel obliged to say that given that we're working with the Scottish Government, what we're talking about here is certainly not official Scottish Government policy. All we're talking about is a tool which will help these kind of strategic conversations that we need to be having today. So some of the questions that we're asking in this process is, how might the world be different looking out towards 2025? So Andrew's covered some of these, but what are existing policies and plans? Are they likely to be effective across a wider range of alternative futures? What about the government's ambitions for a greener, fairer, and more prosperous Scotland? Ministers talk about this as their North Star. So how might the crisis actually change how we get there, how we realise these ambitions? Some things have been stalled, some things potentially can be accelerated. So are there transformative ideas that can really help push us forward? And finally, as I've said, what are the insights that we need to take from this exercise to inform the decisions that we need to take today? So if we move on to the next slide. So what we're doing at the moment is delivering a process jointly with the Scottish Government and working with a much wider range of organisations across Scotland to use scenarios to really help us think through the implications of the pandemic in this way. So we're feeding in directly to the Scottish Government's Renew work stream, looking out in the medium term, longer term. Scottish Enterprise has got a future economy work stream, and we're also working alongside SDS with the Keep Scotland Working project. So during June, we're delivering a series of facilitated workshops involving around 200 people across Scotland from public, private and third sectors. And what we're doing is focusing in on around 10 key policy and delivery themes. So things like climate change and energy, manufacturing industries, consumer-facing industries, infrastructure in place, digital, and tackling inequalities. We're also working with SDS to share our thinking around potential labour market implications. So unfortunately, we don't have the resources to scale this up across every policy area or every organisation. But what we are doing at the moment is developing a scenarios toolkit. So using that alongside the scenarios, we're going to make that available to other organisations so they can actually go through this process for themselves. So we can maybe come back to that later in the session. So we move on to the next slide. So the scenarios we're using, we're actually adapting a set of global scenarios that were originally developed by Deloitte and Salesforce in the States. So we've adapted these to Scotland, and they were created by actually a team of world-leading futurists, people like Peter Schwartz and Andrew Goudie, and so we continue to swap notes with them. So Andrew's talked around some of the key drivers of change here. So, and you can see a much longer list on the right-hand side. So what we're trying to do is acknowledge the complexity of the world that we live in and the range of interdependent drivers, and try to weave these together into a set of narrative scenarios that tell us stories about how the future may play out. So in the set of scenarios, the two most important drivers, most uncertain drivers, are the top two. So it's the severity of the pandemic. You know, how long might that last? You know, how many, will we find a vaccine soon? This year, next year? Or might we see multiple waves of infections progressing around the world? And then secondly, we've got the level of collaboration between countries. How can we work together to find solutions, be they health related or economic or financial? How do we get through this together, and to what extent can collaboration help us get through this? So these are the drivers. What I want to do, if we move on to the next slide, is talk a little bit more about the scenarios themselves. So I'll just paint some pictures here. Hopefully it'll give you a sense. So on the right-hand side, you can see the two main uncertainties as the drivers of change. So these are a relative scale. So if we take the passing storm, the first scenario, this is really a world where a solution, a vaccine, effective treatments to the virus are found relatively quickly, and where there's a high degree of collaboration around the world. So you might see a quick rebound, or a relatively quick rebound, perhaps into next year, starting later this year. But it's not without its impact. So within each of these scenarios, there are positive and negative elements. So we know, looking from today's perspective, there are still massive impacts in terms of jobs, businesses, rising inequalities, etc. So within Scotland, this might be a good world for the life sciences, for healthcare sectors, for technology sectors, but perhaps less so for tourism and education, who are facing a long-term return to growth. But it might be a world where we see a green recovery, and within Scotland, COP26 takes place next year. If we go to the opposite end and talk about lone wolves, here we've got a pandemic that endures for perhaps several years. There's not the collaboration to find a vaccine, to find solutions that are going to help the globe find synchronous ways to get through this. So in many ways, it's really quite a bleak scenario. Within Scotland, you might see widening societal fractures across classes, generations, and regions, growing inequalities. Andrew's talked about public finances. There might be real struggles to find ways to pay for the crisis and to invest in recovery. But in some ways, it might actually, for some communities globally and in Scotland, there might be some positives. It might be a world where some can look for greater self-sufficiency, in terms of reshored supply chains or greater energy or food security. That might be a positive in this world. If we now turn to good company, this is a world where companies are part of the solution. They work with governments to find solutions. So the scenario here talks about stakeholder capitalism. We might talk about inclusive growth. This might be a world where we see a green economic stimulus, a move towards creating a well-being economy. We might see a decentralized innovation system that and companies playing a role in providing healthcare solutions and green technologies, both at home and globally. But it might also be a world where there are tensions over the costs of state intervention. And then this is also a world where technology is accelerated, and that might bring risks over control of data by big tech companies, concerns over social divides, and maybe also lack of public scrutiny over the activities of businesses. So not altogether a positive world. There's a mix of different drivers. And then finally, sunrise in the east. This I think of as the kind of geopolitical scenario. So essentially, it's one where China and other East Asian countries find a solution to the virus, and they bounce back much more quickly than some of the Western nations. But in doing so, what actually happens is that accelerates China's emergence as a dominant global power. So it changes the balance of power globally. So within Scotland, what you might see is rising Asian imports and investment, a subtle shift over time away from the EU towards Asia. So there might be a rise in new jobs and health and tech-related innovation. It might be a world that's good for entrepreneurship. But nevertheless, there are still high business failure rates, growing poverty, rising long-term unemployment. But as I say, it's a world of, you might call it global regionalism, where the US, EU, and Asia battle it out for things like data privacy or trade standards. So quite a few tensions playing out. So I've just tried to kind of paint some pictures about alternative scenarios. So hopefully you can see signals from today, issues playing out in today's papers, today's headlines in each of these four. So just to finish off then on the next slide, just before we go out into the breakouts, I just want to ask, what future are we planning for? So in reality, the future may be a mix of all of these four scenarios I've talked about. And as Andrew said, some of these changes could be temporary, some of them could become permanent. At the moment, we don't really know. But when we're thinking about scenarios, it's tempting really to take the good bits and ignore the bad bits. But really what I'd ask you to do is just suspend that personal bias or that judgment and try and live in the scenarios and ask, well, what would we do? So just think about how they might challenge our assumptions. So what if the state continued to be a long-term investor in the private sector? What if a green recovery isn't a done deal, perhaps in the lone wolf scenario? What if Scotland couldn't grow its economy through global trade, if that was closed down over the medium term? And what if we see a retreat of office space from city and town centres, which actually changes the way in which places operate over the long term? So try and think about some of these assumptions and how Scotland's economy might evolve. Charlie.
That's good. Thank you, Ewan. That's given us a lot to ponder on. So I think probably without much further ado, let's move into the individual breakout rooms and take that sort of the big picture that you've got from Andrew and Ewan there and apply it to some more specific topics around infrastructure in place, labour markets, business resilience, climate change and energy.